Good evening, Horror Stories. My name is Michael. A few years ago, I worked as a janitor in a funeral home, and I must say that I had a hard time getting used to the job. As you can imagine, being around deceased people creates a dense and charged atmosphere. The place was always full of sad and distraught family members, which made the atmosphere generally very depressing. To work in such an environment, you really need to have a very cold mind. But the truth was very well paid, so I accepted. One night, what I least expected in a job like this happened. The body of a girl of about 6 years old arrived. I found out because I was assigned, along with another colleague, the task of carrying the small coffin to the room where they prepare the deceased, and I was deeply distressed that day, especially since I have a daughter of a similar age. However, I struggled to maintain the boundary between my work and my emotions. As I mentioned earlier, in this type of work it is crucial to keep a cool head. I never find out or want to know the cause of deaths, as the less I know about the deceased, the better I can do my job without getting emotionally involved. That night I stayed to clean the funeral home as usual, and to prepare the room where the girl would be laid to rest the next day. Given how late it was, no one else was supposed to be there. Just me and the woman in charge of preparing the deceased. There were no family members or other personnel present. It was almost 10 p.m., and I had to hurry so as not to miss the bus, but I still had a lot of work to do. I wanted to get home before my wife and daughter went to bed. That day more than ever, I felt the need to see them. Carrying that little girl's empty coffin had left me in a state of shock. I was finishing cleaning the bathrooms when I heard footsteps approaching and entering one of the nearby cubicles, closing the door behind me. I was inside another bathroom, so I couldn't see who had entered, but I assumed it was the woman who prepares the deceased since we were the only ones in the place. I told her to go in quietly, that I would come out and wait outside until she was finished. I opened the door and quickly went out. After waiting for about 10 minutes or so, I was surprised that the doctor had not responded to me when I spoke to her earlier, and that it took her so long to come out. I approached the front door of the bathroom and asked her if she was okay, but received no response. I began to worry, thinking that maybe she was feeling bad and needed help. I yelled at him again, but only silence answered me. I decided to go in and look under the doors and was surprised to see little girls' feet with little pink shoes and socks with hearts on them. I didn't say anything to the girl. I just walked out of the bathroom and went straight to where the doctor was preparing the body. I knocked on the door and asked her if I could come out for a moment. She came out immediately and asked me if I needed anything. I then asked her if she had brought her daughter or if she knew who the girl in the women's bathroom was. She looked at me in surprise and told me that she had no children. Plus, there couldn't be any girls there, as the funeral home had closed an hour ago and all the employees had finished their shifts. There were only the two of us left. He asked me if I was sure I had seen someone in the bathroom, to which I replied that yes, I was absolutely sure that I had seen a very small girl. He suggested we go check it out, so we quickly headed for the women's restroom. I pointed to the door where I had seen the girl. The doctor went in immediately and opened the door, but all the cubicles in the bathroom were empty. There was no sign of anyone. We went all over the funeral home looking for the girl, but found no trace. Doctor told me that she had to finish her work and asked me if I heard or saw anything again, to go and look for her immediately to let her know. She left and I continued with my work, but I couldn't get the image of those little feet in the bathroom out of my mind. I was so sure of what I had seen that I began to feel like I was going crazy. The doctor finished her work and explained that it was late, suggesting that I should also leave to rest. I interpreted her advice as a subtle way of telling me that perhaps what I saw was a product of fatigue. I simply replied, "Good night, doctor, get some rest," and then headed to the small room where they watch over the deceased to clean it. It was the last thing I needed to do before I could go home. Everything was going normally until I heard the cry of a small child. I left the room to better identify where the sound was coming from, and realized that it seemed to be coming from the room where the deceased are placed in their coffins, waiting to be veiled. I remained in shock for a few minutes until I decided to approach slowly, opened the door, and asked in a cracked voice, "Hello, is anyone there?" And, at that precise moment, the crying stopped completely. An overwhelming silence invaded the room. The only coffin there was the coffin of the girl who had arrived earlier that night, closed and with her body inside. I closed the door to leave, but immediately I heard the girl's cry again. A disconsolate cry that left no room for doubt. It came from that same room. I did not dare to open the door again. At that moment, I knew with certainty that the cry belonged to the deceased child and that the little feet I had seen in the bathroom were also hers. I took my things and left there immediately. I was completely overwhelmed and could not stay one more second in that place. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept thinking about that little girl. Even though I knew she was helpless, I was terrified to hear her cry after her death. The next day when I arrived at work, the child was already being watched over. Her parents were at her side, crying inconsolably. The girl was about to be taken to the cemetery for burial. I heard the mother say that she would accompany her daughter in the hearse because the little girl was very afraid of the dark and of being alone. The mother, between sobs, begged to be allowed to go with her so as not to leave her alone on her last trip. The driver allowed her to ride in the passenger seat, and at that moment, as everyone began to leave, I understood that the little girl did not want me to leave that night. She didn't want to be alone in the dark, and so she cried incessantly. That revelation left me with a lump in my throat. All day long I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. The idea that this little girl, trapped between this world and the other, had tried to communicate with me in her desperation not to be left alone, shook me deeply. As I went about my chores, every corner of the funeral home seemed to be permeated with her presence as if she was still seeking solace in the midst of her loneliness. And that night, before going to sleep, I lit a candle in her memory and prayed that her spirit might find the peace it so desperately needed. Although working at the funeral home was never easy, after that day, my perception changed completely. Not only was I surrounded by lifeless bodies, but also by souls that perhaps still needed help to find their way. That little girl left me with a lesson I will never forget. That even in death, the fear of darkness and loneliness can persist, and that sometimes it only takes a little light to guide them to eternal rest. After talking to my wife, she advised me to quit and look for another job. I had a hard time falling asleep after that experience, so after a few days of reflection, I decided to quit my job. However, what happened still disturbs me to this day. The experience left me with a paranormal experience that I would not wish on anyone. The scariest thing was that after that event, my youngest daughter started talking and playing with an imaginary friend, something that seemed normal to me given her age. However, one day I asked her what her friend's name was, and she replied that her name was Kelly, the same name as the deceased girl. If you have enjoyed this story, we invite you to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any others. Until next time.